Daniel Brooks woke before sunrise, the kind of gray-blue light that slipped through the thin blinds of his small apartment in South Chicago. The room was quiet except for the faint breathing of his daughter, Lily Brooks, curled under a faded blanket on the couch. Daniel, a 38-year-old black single father, moved carefully through the silence, like the house itself was something fragile he had to protect. He worked nights as a maintenance technician at a commercial auto facility, the kind of place where grease never fully left your skin and people rarely remembered your name. His hands were already rough from years of labor, his uniform slightly worn at the cuffs, but every morning he still tied his boots with the same quiet discipline, the same steady rhythm that kept his world from falling apart. Lily was his center of gravity. Ever since her mother left years ago, it had been just the two of them, surviving on routines, cheap meals, and the kind of love that never needed words to be proven. That morning, she sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, watching him pack her small lunchbox. "You're not late today, right, Daddy?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled without showing fatigue. "Not today, baby. I'm here." But even as he said it, something in his chest tightened. Because today was not like the others. Today, he had already decided he wouldn't go back to the garage. The job had stopped paying enough to justify the nights away from her, and the humiliation from supervisors who never looked him in the eye had finally reached its limit. He had signed the resignation form the night before, folded it carefully, and left it on the counter like a silent confession to the life he was walking away from. Across the city, Catherine Monroe stood inside the glass-walled top floor of Monroe Global Holdings, her presence as precise and controlled as the skyline behind her. A billionaire CEO in her early 30s, elegant, polished, and unreadable, she moved through boardroom discussions like a force of calculation rather than emotion. People followed her instructions before she finished speaking. Yet beneath her composure was a quiet exhaustion she never allowed anyone to see. That morning, she received a report that made her pause longer than usual, a resignation filed by an employee whose name had come up in internal logistics tracking more than once, Daniel Brooks. No accolades. No promotions. Just consistency. Something about it lingered in her mind longer than it should have. Something felt wrong. She didn't know why. By late afternoon, Daniel was at home repairing a broken kitchen cabinet while Lily drew at the table, crayons scattered like little bursts of color against their modest world. The air smelled faintly of coffee gone cold and metal from his old toolbox resting near the sink. He moved with quiet precision, tightening screws, adjusting hinges, the way he fixed everything in his life, without complaint, without noise. Then came the knock. Not urgent. Not casual. Controlled. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second, exchanged a glance with Lily, then walked to the door. When he opened it, the contrast hit immediately. Catherine Monroe stood there in a tailored coat, her presence almost unreal against the worn hallway. Expensive perfume lingered subtly in the air, but her expression wasn't indulgent or curious, it was focused, searching, like she had already decided this moment mattered more than she understood. Daniel didn't speak at first. He simply observed her the way he observed everything, carefully, calmly, without giving away reaction. Catherine's eyes briefly shifted past him, landing on the small apartment behind him, the child's drawing taped to the wall, the lunchbox on the counter, the worn shoes near the door. A flicker passed through her gaze. Not judgment. Recognition. Or something close to it. "Mr. Brooks," she said finally, voice steady but quieter than in any boardroom. Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." A silence stretched between them, heavy enough that even Lily, standing behind her father, stopped moving. Catherine hesitated, which was unusual for someone like her. Then she said, "I didn't expect you to leave." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed even. "I did what I had to do." Something in her expression shifted, just barely. Like a calculation no longer adding up. Behind them, Lily stepped forward a little, holding her drawing. She looked up at Catherine with innocent curiosity, then said softly, "Are you here for my daddy's old job?" The question landed differently than intended. Catherine blinked once. Then twice. And for the first time that day, she didn't have a rehearsed answer. Something about the child's tone, the simplicity of it, seemed to cut through whatever structure she had walked in with. Daniel placed a protective hand lightly on his daughter's shoulder, not restrictive, just present. Grounded. "It's okay," he said quietly, not to Catherine, but to Lily. Still, Catherine didn't look away. Her gaze lingered on Daniel longer now, noticing details she hadn't before, the steady hands, the calm posture, the absence of desperation in a man who had every reason to feel it. Then she said something unexpected. "Your resignation wasn't supposed to be approved this quickly." Daniel frowned slightly. "I didn't ask for approval." A pause. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing important was happening, but inside that small hallway, the air had changed density. Catherine reached into her folder slowly and pulled out a document. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Controlled. But when Daniel saw the header, his expression shifted just slightly, enough for Catherine to notice. "This," she said carefully, "isn't just about your job." Lily looked between them, sensing something she couldn't name. Daniel didn't touch the paper yet. He just stared at it, like it belonged to a version of his life he had already tried to leave behind. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "I thought that part was over." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "So did I." And in that moment, neither of them said the thing hovering just beneath the surface, the thing neither fully understood yet, but both had just stepped closer to without realizing. Before we go deeper into what he discovered that day, tell us where you're watching from and do not forget to subscribe, because what happened next changed the way everyone looked at him. Catherine's hand tightened slightly on the folder. Lily leaned closer to her father. And Daniel Brooks, the man who thought he had already left everything behind, realized that the truth he had been avoiding was no longer something he could walk away from. Catherine's final words came softer, almost unintentional, "Daniel. There's something about your daughter that doesn't match your file." Daniel looked up slowly. And for the first time since he quit his job, he felt the ground beneath his life shift in a way he could not yet name. Daniel Brooks did not move at first. The document in Catherine Monroe's hand felt heavier than paper should feel, as if it carried more than ink and signatures. Behind him, Lily stood quietly, her small fingers still holding the edge of her drawing, watching both adults with the kind of attention children have when they sense something important but cannot name it. Catherine's eyes stayed on Daniel, not aggressive, not soft either, but focused in a way that suggested she had been carrying this moment longer than she admitted. The hallway behind them was silent except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator inside the apartment and the distant sound of traffic moving through late afternoon streets. Daniel finally reached for the document, not rushing, not resisting, just steady. His eyes scanned the header and then paused. Something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly, not shock, but recognition. Something felt wrong. Not new wrong. Old wrong resurfacing. Catherine noticed immediately. She stepped slightly forward, lowering her voice. "You have seen this before, haven't you?" Daniel did not answer right away. He looked down at Lily instead, as if grounding himself in something real before responding. "I have seen something like this," he said quietly, carefully choosing each word. Catherine studied him longer now, her polished composure beginning to show the smallest fractures of uncertainty. This was not the reaction she expected. In her world, people reacted quickly, defensively, or strategically. Daniel Brooks did none of those things. Instead, he was still, like a man measuring the weight of a memory he had already buried. Lily shifted slightly behind him. "Daddy, is everything okay?" she asked softly. Daniel turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. "Yes, baby. Just talking." His voice stayed calm, but something in it tightened, a protective instinct rising quietly but firmly. Catherine noticed that too. Not the words, but the way he said them. Controlled. Grounded. prioritizing the child without hesitation. A detail she did not expect to matter stayed in her mind longer than she wanted it to. Catherine adjusted her grip on the folder. "This file should not exist outside of executive review," she said. "And yet it is connected to your resignation." Daniel finally looked at her fully. "I resigned because I wanted to stay with my daughter," he said. "Whatever is in there is not part of my life anymore." Catherine's expression shifted slightly at that sentence. Not disbelief, but calculation. As if his answer did not fit the structure she had built in her mind. Behind them, Lily walked a small step closer to her father, her presence quiet but steady. Catherine's gaze briefly dropped to the child again, then returned to Daniel. "Then explain something to me," she said, her tone lower now. "Why does your personnel record include a classified clearance notation that should not belong to a maintenance technician?" A pause followed. The air in the hallway seemed to thin. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window at the end of the corridor, where the fading light of the city pressed softly against the glass. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "That was a long time ago." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Long time ago does not remove it from records." Daniel exhaled slowly. Not frustration. Not fear. Something closer to restraint. "I am not that person anymore," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Catherine held his gaze, and for the first time since arriving, she did not interrupt. Something in his tone made her pause, not because it answered her question, but because it did not try to impress her or defend itself. It simply existed as truth. Lily tugged lightly on Daniel's sleeve. "Daddy, can I show her my drawing?" she asked suddenly. The shift was small, but it changed the air. Daniel looked down at her, then nodded once. Lily stepped forward and extended the paper toward Catherine. Catherine hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. She looked down. It was simple. Crayon lines. A small house. A man holding a child's hand under a sky filled with uneven stars. Catherine studied it longer than expected. Then something subtle happened in her expression. Not a smile. Not softness. But a moment of stillness that had nothing to do with corporate control. She handed it back gently. "You drew this?" she asked Lily. The girl nodded. "It is Daddy and me." Catherine looked at Daniel again, but this time differently. Not as an employee file. Not as a name in a system. But as something harder to categorize. Daniel noticed the shift. He did not react to it, but he felt it. Catherine closed the folder slowly. "I am not done understanding this," she said quietly. Daniel met her eyes one last time. "Neither am I," he replied. A silence followed, deeper than before, not uncomfortable, but unfinished. Catherine turned slightly as if preparing to leave, then stopped. Her voice lowered, almost as if speaking more to herself than to him. "There is a gap in your history I cannot ignore." Daniel said nothing. Lily looked between them again, sensing the tension but not afraid of it. Catherine finally stepped back toward the door. But just before she left, she glanced once more at Lily, then at Daniel, and said softly, "Whatever you think you left behind, it did not stay buried." The door remained open after she walked away, and Daniel did not move to close it immediately. He stood there, holding silence like something fragile, while Lily quietly returned to her drawing behind him. And in that moment, without explanation, without resolution, something long dormant began to shift just beneath the surface of everything he thought he had already escaped. Daniel Brooks did not sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because of thought. The kind of thought that stays quiet on the surface while shifting everything underneath. Lily was already asleep on the couch, one arm resting over her sketchbook, breathing slow and steady. The apartment was dim, lit only by the weak glow of a streetlight slipping through the blinds. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where he had signed his resignation just a day earlier. Catherine Monroe's visit still lingered in his mind like an unfinished sentence. The document she left behind lay unopened beside him now, carefully aligned with the edge of the table, as if distance alone could neutralize its weight. Something felt wrong, but not in a way he could immediately name. It was deeper than confusion. It was recognition trying to surface. Across the city, Catherine sat in her car outside a glass building, not moving for several minutes. Her driver waited quietly, sensing not to interrupt. In her hand was Lily's drawing, still folded slightly from earlier. A simple child's image, yet it had stayed with her longer than any financial report she had reviewed that week. She should have left it behind. Instead, she kept it. Catherine Monroe was not someone who lingered on irrelevant details, yet she found herself replaying Daniel's expression when he saw the file. Not surprise. Not denial. Something more controlled. Something guarded. It unsettled her. Back in the apartment, Daniel finally opened the folder. The pages inside were clean, official, and precise. His name appeared multiple times, attached to records that did not align with the life he was currently living. Employment logs, clearance notes, internal references to a division he had never spoken about to anyone in years. His fingers stopped moving. For a brief moment, the sound of the refrigerator filled the silence too loudly. He closed the folder halfway, then reopened it, as if confirming it still existed. Lily stirred slightly on the couch. "Daddy," she murmured without opening her eyes. Daniel immediately softened his expression. "I am here," he said gently. She relaxed again. That small exchange anchored him back into the present, but the past did not leave. It never did. He placed the folder away from her sight, pushing it under a stack of unopened mail. Not hiding it from curiosity, but from consequence. Something felt wrong in a way that did not belong to today. It belonged to another version of his life. One he had deliberately stepped away from. The next morning came too quickly. Daniel moved through routine out of habit, preparing breakfast, tying Lily's shoes, adjusting her backpack before school. She watched him carefully. Children always notice when something shifts, even if they cannot explain it. "Are you going to work today?" she asked. He paused just slightly longer than usual. "No," he said finally. "I am staying with you." Lily nodded, satisfied, but her eyes lingered on him as if she sensed an answer beneath the answer. After she left for school, Daniel stood alone in the small apartment for several minutes. Silence pressed against him differently now. It was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. He walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Nothing unusual. People moving. Cars passing. Life continuing without awareness of what had been placed back into motion. Then his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He did not answer immediately. He stared at it until it stopped, then started again. This time, he picked up. "Daniel Brooks," a professional voice said on the other end. "This is Monroe Holdings Compliance Office. We need to confirm receipt of confidential documentation delivered yesterday." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Not frustration. Not surprise. Something closer to inevitability. "I received it," he said. A pause followed. "You are required to attend a verification meeting," the voice continued. "Catherine Monroe has personally requested your presence." Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the phone. He looked toward the hallway where Lily's shoes were still neatly placed by the door. "When?" he asked. "Today," the voice replied. 1 hour. The line disconnected. Daniel stood still for a moment longer than necessary. Then he exhaled slowly, as if accepting a weight he had already known was coming back. He moved to the table and looked at the folder again. This time, he did not open it. Instead, he placed his hand on it for a few seconds. Not as a man preparing for conflict. but as someone acknowledging that the past had finally found the correct address. Somewhere across the city, Catherine Monroe was already waiting, and neither of them fully understood yet why this meeting was not just procedural, but personal in a way neither had agreed to remember. Daniel Brooks arrived at the Monroe Holdings Tower exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled time. The building rose above the city like a statement of power made of glass and silence. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors reflected the movement of people who never paused, never hesitated, all moving with the certainty of belonging. Daniel stood for a moment near the entrance, adjusting his jacket that had seen better years. It was clean, simple, and clearly not built for spaces like this. He noticed it immediately, the subtle shift in how security glanced at him, not openly hostile, but categorizing. Something felt wrong, not in action, but in placement, as if he had stepped into a version of reality that had not been designed with him in mind. Still, he moved forward. Calm. Measured. Lily's voice echoed in his memory from the morning, asking if he would be home early. That thought grounded him more than anything else. In the upper-floor conference suite, Catherine Monroe reviewed the same folder again, though she already knew every line by heart. She stood near the glass wall overlooking the city, her reflection layered over the skyline like two versions of herself that never fully aligned. Her assistant spoke softly behind her, confirming Daniel Brooks had arrived in the lobby. Catherine did not respond immediately. Instead, she closed the folder and placed it down with careful precision. Something about this meeting was no longer purely procedural. It had shifted sometime between the moment she saw his resignation and the moment she saw his daughter's drawing. She did not like uncertainty, yet she could not ignore it either. Downstairs, Daniel was escorted upward in silence. The elevator ride was smooth, almost too smooth, the kind of engineered quiet that made every thought louder. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored wall and saw no version of himself that matched the environment around him. But he did not flinch. Years of responsibility had taught him how to remain steady in rooms that did not recognize him. When the doors opened, Catherine was already waiting. Not seated behind a desk. Not surrounded by staff. Just standing near the window, facing away at first. She turned when he entered. The space between them felt wider than the room itself. "Daniel Brooks," she said calmly. "Thank you for coming." He nodded once. "You said it was required." A brief pause followed. Not tension, but recognition of boundaries. Catherine gestured toward the table. "Please sit." He did, but only after a measured second, placing his hands in a resting position that suggested readiness without submission. Catherine observed this quietly before speaking again. "We need to clarify your connection to this file." Daniel did not respond immediately. He had expected questions, but not the tone she was using. It was not accusatory. It was careful, as if she was approaching something she did not want to damage. "There is no connection anymore," he said. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in analysis. "That is not what the record suggests." Daniel leaned back slightly, still composed. Records do not always reflect decisions made under pressure. A subtle shift passed through Catherine's expression. Not emotional, but cognitive. Something in his phrasing aligned with something she had not yet admitted to herself. Behind her polished authority, there was a brief hesitation. She stepped closer to the table and placed a single page in front of him. It contained only a name and a date. Daniel looked at it. His jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but Catherine did. Something felt wrong again, but this time it was not external. It was internal recognition trying to surface without permission. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Catherine did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if recalibrating assumptions she had carried for years. "Because your resignation triggered a review protocol," she said finally. "And that review revealed inconsistencies." Daniel's gaze did not move from the paper. "Inconsistencies that existed long before I left," he said. Catherine did not deny it. That silence was louder than agreement. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its movement, unaware of the quiet tension forming in a room far above it. Catherine finally spoke again, softer this time. There is something about your past assignment that was never fully documented. Daniel's expression remained steady, but his attention sharpened. Not fear. Awareness. Catherine continued, and it involves timing that overlaps with. She stopped herself briefly, as if choosing whether to proceed. Daniel finished the sentence for her without knowing why he knew to do so. My daughter. The word settled between them differently than everything else that had been said. Catherine did not confirm it immediately. Instead, she exhaled slowly, the first sign of anything resembling uncertainty in her otherwise controlled demeanor. Daniel looked down at the table again, then at the document. His voice lowered slightly. If this is about her, then you are asking the wrong questions. Catherine met his gaze directly. Then tell me which questions are right. A long silence followed. Not empty, but heavy with something neither of them was ready to name. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her toward the city again, as if searching for a version of time where this conversation had never begun. Then quietly, he said, some answers are not meant to be given in offices like this. Catherine's expression shifted again, subtly this time, as if realizing that control had limitations she had not accounted for. And in that moment, neither of them noticed how the name on the document between them seemed to carry more weight than paper should, or how a truth neither had fully spoken was already beginning to move closer to the surface, quietly, inevitably, without permission. The silence inside the Monroe Holdings executive suite had shifted. It was no longer the controlled silence of a corporate meeting room, but something heavier, more uncertain, like a pause before an impact that had not yet arrived. Daniel Brooks remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the edge of the table, though his attention was no longer on Catherine Monroe's carefully arranged documents. It was elsewhere, somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Catherine stood near the glass wall again, her reflection fractured against the skyline, her posture still perfect but no longer effortless. Something in Daniel's last words had disrupted her usual rhythm of control. Questions, in her world, were supposed to lead to answers. But Daniel Brooks spoke like a man who understood that some answers came with consequences too heavy to name. She turned slightly, her voice lower now, less formal. Then explain this, she said, sliding another page across the table. Daniel looked at it. This one carried timestamps. Internal routing codes. A reference chain that connected to a division he had not worked for in years. His eyes paused longer this time. Not confusion. Recognition layered with distance. Something felt wrong again, but differently now. Not external. Structural. Like pieces of a past he had sealed were being carefully reopened one by one. You were assigned to systems oversight during that period, Catherine continued, watching him closely. But there is no record of your final report. Daniel exhaled slowly. Because it was never meant to be archived publicly. Catherine studied him. That is not how protocol works. Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a truth that did not help either of them. Not all protocols survive the people who write them. The words hung in the air longer than expected. Catherine did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned away briefly, looking out at the city below, her mind processing something that did not fit neatly into her structured understanding of operations, hierarchy, or control. For the first time, she did not immediately counter. Daniel noticed that silence. It was different from hesitation. It was reconsideration. Behind them, the city continued moving, indifferent to the conversation unfolding above it. Inside the room, however, time felt slightly misaligned, as if one decision from the past had just started echoing into the present. Catherine finally spoke again, quieter. If what you are implying is true, then your resignation is not an isolated event. Daniel looked at her steadily. Nothing about that period was isolated. A subtle tension tightened in Catherine's expression, not anger, but something closer to realization beginning to take shape against her will. She returned to the table and placed both hands on it, grounding herself. "Then why leave now?" she asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. He looked down for a moment, as if weighing how much of the truth could be spoken without reopening what had already been sealed. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but lower. "Because staying meant repeating something I already paid for once." Catherine's gaze sharpened slightly. "Paid for how?" Daniel paused. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried history. "Finally," he said, "in ways that do not appear in files." Catherine's expression shifted again. This time, it was not calculation. It was something closer to discomfort, as if the edges of her controlled world were no longer aligning properly. She stepped back slightly, then walked toward the window again, needing distance to process what proximity had begun to reveal. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the building systems and the distant movement of traffic far below. Then Catherine turned back. "There is something else," she said. Daniel looked up. Catherine hesitated for the first time since he had met her. The internal review flagged a secondary linkage, she continued carefully. A dependency record that was never fully resolved. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "And?" he asked. Catherine held his gaze. "It references your daughter." The room changed again. Not loudly. Not visibly. But undeniably. Daniel did not react outwardly, but something in his posture shifted, subtle but protective. Catherine noticed immediately. "I am not saying she is involved," she added quickly, as if correcting the implication. "I am saying her existence appears in a system that should not have access to her data." Daniel stood slowly now. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just with intention. "Then your system is wrong," he said quietly. Catherine did not respond at once. The confidence she usually carried seemed slightly recalibrated. She was not used to being uncertain in front of anyone, especially not in her own office. But Daniel Brooks was not reacting like someone caught in exposure. He was reacting like someone watching something carefully contained begin to shift. "I need access to that record," Catherine said finally. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. One word. Calm. Final. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "You do not have authority to deny it." Daniel met her gaze evenly. "And you do not understand what opening it will do." Another silence followed, heavier this time, not filled with conflict but with implication. Catherine studied him for several seconds longer than before, as if trying to determine whether his resistance was protective instinct or knowledge. Then, unexpectedly, her voice softened slightly. "Then tell me what I am missing." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. For the first time since this meeting began, there was something almost imperceptible in his expression. Not trust. Not surrender. But acknowledgement that the past was no longer something he could keep separate from the present. "You are missing context," he said quietly. Catherine held that sentence in silence. And for the first time, she did not immediately seek to replace uncertainty with control. Instead, she simply stood there, realizing that whatever had been hidden between records, files, and silence was no longer staying buried the way it once had. The silence in Catherine Monroe's office did not break immediately after Daniel Brooks spoke. It lingered, dense and unfamiliar, as if the room itself had lost its usual structure. Catherine stood near the glass wall, her reflection layered over the city skyline, but her focus was no longer outside. It was inside the conversation that had just shifted in a direction she did not fully control. Daniel remained seated, still, composed, his presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty forming in her thoughts. Something felt wrong, but not in the way corporate anomalies usually felt. This was personal interference inside a system that was supposed to remain impersonal. Catherine finally turned back toward him, her voice quieter than before. Context alone does not justify missing documentation, she said carefully. Daniel looked up at her, not reacting to the authority in her tone, but acknowledging the limitation of it. Context is the only thing that explains what you will not find in your system, he replied. A pause followed. Catherine studied him longer now, not as an employee, not even as a subject of review, but as a variable that did not align with expected outcomes. She stepped away from the window and moved slowly toward the table again. Then give me the context, she said. Daniel did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted briefly toward the door, then toward the hallway beyond it, where Lily was not present but remained the center of everything he did. When he spoke, his voice was lower. Some context is not safe to revisit without consequences. Catherine's expression tightened slightly. Consequences for whom? Daniel met her gaze. For everyone involved. The weight of that sentence changed the atmosphere again. Not dramatically, but precisely, like a pressure adjustment no one had requested. Catherine exhaled slowly, then lowered herself into the chair opposite him. For the first time since the meeting began, she was not standing. That alone signaled a shift. I am not asking as your superior, she said after a moment. I am asking because the system is incomplete, and incomplete systems create risk. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the logic without agreeing to the exposure. Incomplete systems were intentional, he said. Catherine frowned slightly. Intentional by who? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was not uncertainty. It was restraint. By people who believed silence was safer than explanation, he said finally. Catherine leaned back slightly, absorbing that answer. It was not technical. It was not procedural. It was human. And it disrupted her framework more than any missing file could. She looked down at the document again, then closed it halfway without realizing she had moved. Your daughter's name appears once, she said carefully. Daniel's posture changed subtly at the mention, not defensive, but protective. Then it should not be in your system at all, he replied. Catherine nodded slowly. That is exactly why I am asking. A brief silence followed. The kind of silence that no longer felt like absence, but transition. Daniel finally spoke again. If her name is there, it is not because she belongs to that system. It is because the system intersected with a decision I made outside of it. Catherine studied him closely. What decision? Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes lowered briefly, as if reviewing something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice carried less resistance, but more distance. A decision to leave something behind before it could be used incorrectly. Catherine's expression shifted slightly. Used by whom? Daniel looked up at her. That is the part you are not ready to read yet. The words landed without force, but with clarity. Catherine did not respond immediately. Instead, she sat in silence for several seconds, processing the structure of what he was saying. Not refusal. Not evasion. Control. Not over-information, but over-timing. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion, glass towers reflecting light that had no awareness of what was being discussed above it. Catherine finally spoke again, more measured now. Then why come here at all? Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because you already opened the door I was trying to keep closed, he said quietly. Catherine did not deny it. For the first time, she looked away, just briefly, as if acknowledging that her actions had consequences she had not fully mapped. When she looked back, her tone was no longer procedural. I need to know if this affects current operations, she said. Daniel nodded slightly. It does not affect operations, he replied. A pause. It affects memory. That sentence lingered longer than any document between them. Catherine closed the folder fully now, placing both hands on it, not as control, but as containment. Daniel stood slowly, signaling the conversation had reached its current limit. Catherine did not stop him. Instead, she remained seated, watching as he adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, she spoke once more. "Daniel," she said. He paused but did not turn fully. "If there is something I am missing, it will surface eventually." Daniel turned slightly then, enough for her to see his expression clearly. "Some things do not surface," he said quietly. "They wait." And then he left the room. Catherine remained seated long after the door closed. The city outside continued its predictable rhythm, but inside the office, something had shifted without resolution. The folder remained in front of her, closed but not forgotten, and for the first time in a long time, Catherine Monroe did not immediately reach for the next step. Daniel Brooks left the Monroe Holdings tower without looking back, but the weight of the conversation followed him into the elevator, into the lobby, and all the way onto the street where the afternoon air felt colder than it should have. People passed him in waves, dressed in tailored confidence and fast schedules, none of them noticing the man who had just walked out of a room that quietly rearranged his past. His phone remained in his pocket, silent, but he could feel it there like an unfinished sentence waiting to be spoken again. Something felt wrong, not because of what was said, but because of what had been carefully avoided. Catherine Monroe stood alone in her office long after Daniel left. The city outside shimmered in glass reflections, but she was no longer looking at it. Instead, her attention remained fixed on the closed folder in front of her. For someone who built her entire career on precision, uncertainty was not just uncomfortable, it was inefficient. Yet Daniel Brooks had introduced something she could not yet categorize, a gap in her understanding of a system she believed she controlled. She pressed the intercom. "Pull everything we have on internal routing records from that period," she said calmly. There was a pause on the other end. "All levels, ma'am." "All levels," she repeated. Her voice did not change, but her expression did. Back in the city below, Daniel walked without urgency. He stopped once at a crosswalk, watching traffic move with mechanical rhythm. Lily would be home in a few hours, and that thought anchored him more than anything else. Yet every step he took felt slightly misaligned, like the present was no longer fully separated from something he had left behind. Later that evening, Catherine sat in a restricted archive room inside the Monroe facility. The lighting was softer here, but the silence was heavier. A terminal in front of her displayed segmented records, most of them incomplete or partially redacted. She leaned forward slightly, scanning line after line. Nothing should have been unusual about administrative entries. Yet something kept pulling her attention back to a single pattern, repeated timestamps that did not align with standard reporting cycles. Her assistant stood quietly behind her, not speaking unless spoken to. "These gaps," Catherine said finally, pointing at the screen, "they are not accidental." The assistant hesitated. "They appear to have been manually filtered." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. Manual filtering implied intent. Intent implied awareness. Awareness implied control. She leaned back slowly, her mind shifting from curiosity to something closer to concern. Meanwhile, Daniel was at home helping Lily with a simple school assignment. She sat at the small table, coloring carefully, while he prepared dinner with practiced ease. The apartment was quiet, but not empty. It had the kind of silence that comes from familiarity rather than absence. Lily looked up at him suddenly. "Daddy, do people ever try to change things that already happened?" Daniel paused slightly, holding a spoon over the pot. He turned toward her slowly. "Sometimes," he said gently. "But not everything can be changed." She nodded as if accepting that answer without fully understanding it. Daniel returned to cooking, but her question stayed with him longer than expected. That night, Catherine remained in the archive room after her staff had left. The building had shifted into its after-hours stillness, but she remained in front of the screen. She had found something, not a revelation, but a direction. A thread leading toward a section of records that had been accessed once, years ago, then sealed under administrative override. Her fingers hovered over the command prompt. Something felt wrong again, but this time it was not confusion. It was resistance within the system itself, subtle but deliberate. She stopped before executing the final query. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging that whatever she was approaching was no longer just about documentation. It was about consequence. Far away, Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen after Lily had gone to sleep. The unopened folder from earlier sat on the table again, but this time it no longer felt like an object from the past. It felt like something that had been waiting. He did not open it. Instead, he placed his hand beside it and remained still for a long moment, as if listening to something only he could hear. Catherine, in her silent archive room, stared at the screen without touching it. Two separate lives, moving in different spaces, both drawn toward the same unseen point without yet realizing how close they were to a truth neither of them had fully named. The night in New York had settled into a quiet that felt heavier than usual, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside Monroe Holdings, the executive floor was nearly empty, but Catherine Monroe remained at her desk long after everyone else had left. The glow of multiple monitors reflected across her face, outlining a focus that had shifted from curiosity into something closer to urgency. The system logs she had requested were now fully loaded, but what she saw did not bring clarity. Instead, it deepened the inconsistency. There were access patterns that should not have existed, timestamps that overlapped in ways no standard protocol would allow, and a sealed layer of metadata that resisted normal decryption pathways. Something felt wrong, not in a way that suggested error, but in a way that suggested intention. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her fingers hovering above the keyboard without pressing anything. For someone like her, hesitation was not common. Yet tonight, hesitation had become unavoidable. Daniel Brooks sat at home in silence, the same kitchen light casting a soft glow over the table where the unopened folder still rested. Lily was asleep, her small backpack left by the door from school, a quiet reminder of normal life continuing despite everything shifting underneath it. Daniel did not touch the folder. Instead, he sat across from it, watching it as if distance alone could keep it from reopening something he had already learned to live without. His phone remained silent, but he knew that silence was temporary. Across the city, Catherine finally initiated the next layer of the archive. The screen paused before revealing deeper system references, and for a brief moment, even the interface seemed slower, as if resisting what came next. Then the records appeared. Not full documents. Not complete files. Just fragments. Daniel Brooks' name appeared multiple times, but always connected to a designation that no longer existed in current organizational structure. Catherine frowned slightly. Something felt wrong again, but this time it was not ambiguity. It was suppression. She clicked further, carefully, and a restricted note appeared across the screen, flagged at the highest internal clearance level. Her expression changed subtly as she read. Not shock, but recalibration. This was not about employment history. This was about containment protocols. Meanwhile, Daniel finally stood from the table at home and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, cars passing occasionally, people moving through lives unaware of how fragile systems could be beneath surface order. Lily shifted slightly in her sleep behind him, and that sound grounded him more than anything else in the room. He exhaled slowly, placing one hand on the edge of the counter. Something felt wrong, but not externally anymore. It was returning. Catherine closed her eyes briefly before reopening them, then leaned back in her chair. The implication of what she was seeing was no longer professional. It was personal in a way she had not anticipated. The records did not simply reference Daniel Brooks. They referenced a decision point tied to an event that had been deliberately fragmented across multiple systems, as if someone had ensured no single person would ever see the full picture at once. She stood slowly, stepping away from the monitors, walking toward the glass wall overlooking the city. The lights below moved without awareness, but her mind was no longer with them. It was with the gaps. The missing continuity. The deliberate absence of closure. Back in the apartment, Daniel finally turned his attention to the folder again. This time, he did not move it. He simply looked at it, as if acknowledging that avoidance had reached its limit. He did not open it yet, but his stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of distance. It was the stillness of preparation. Catherine returned to her desk after several minutes and stared at the screen again. She did not proceed further. Instead, she paused on the last visible line of the restricted note, reading it repeatedly without speaking. Something felt wrong, but now it was no longer just about the past. It was about the fact that the past had been structured to remain incomplete. And somewhere between a man who refused to reopen a sealed history and a woman who was beginning to uncover its fragments, a convergence was forming quietly, without permission, without announcement, and without yet revealing what it would ultimately demand. The silence between Daniel Brooks and Catherine Monroe had stretched into something neither of them was willing to name. It was no longer just a meeting or an investigation. It had become a collision of two incomplete truths trying to align without breaking each other apart. Daniel stood near the edge of Catherine's office window, his reflection faint against the city lights, while she remained seated at her desk, the restricted files still open in front of her. Neither spoke for several seconds, as if any word could prematurely collapse what was already unstable. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice controlled but noticeably lower than before. "The system does not just contain missing data," she said. "It contains deliberate absence." Daniel did not turn immediately. When he did, his expression was steady, but there was something heavier behind it now, something that suggested he understood the direction this was moving. "Absence is sometimes protection," he said quietly. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in processing. "Protection from what?" Daniel hesitated. That hesitation was different from before. It was no longer about what he could say. It was about what he had already lived through. "From outcomes that cannot be reversed once exposed," he replied. Catherine stood slowly, moving away from the desk for the first time in several minutes. The city beyond the glass felt distant, almost irrelevant now. "Then someone decided exposure was too dangerous," she said. Daniel nodded once, but did not elaborate. Catherine turned back toward the screen, scrolling again through the fragmented records. This time, she stopped at a line that referenced an administrative override linked to a sealed personnel classification. Her breath slowed slightly. Not because she was surprised, but because she was beginning to understand the structure behind the gaps. Daniel watched her without interrupting. There was no urgency in him, only awareness. Catherine finally spoke again, her tone more measured. "This override was not part of standard compliance," she said. Daniel replied simply, "It was never meant to be seen through standard compliance." A pause followed. Catherine looked at him directly now. "Then why does it lead back to your name?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the window again, as if the answer existed somewhere outside the room. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. "Because I was the last point of contact before the system changed direction." Catherine studied him carefully. "Changed direction toward what?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in memory. "Toward something that required silence to function," he said. Catherine did not respond right away. The phrase settled between them with unusual weight. Silence to function was not a technical description. It was a human decision disguised as procedure. She returned to her desk slowly and sat down, though her posture was no longer fully composed. "And your daughter?" she asked carefully. Daniel's eyes shifted slightly at the mention. "She was never part of that system," he said immediately. Catherine nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. "Then why does her name appear in proximity logs?" Daniel's response came after a brief pause. "Because proximity does not always mean involvement." Catherine leaned back slightly, absorbing that distinction. It did not resolve anything. It complicated everything further. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Not empty quiet, but suspended quiet, like both were standing on the edge of something neither had agreed to approach but both had already entered. Catherine finally closed the folder completely. Not out of conclusion, but restraint. "I cannot proceed without clarity," she said. Daniel looked at her steadily. "Clarity is not what you are being denied," he replied. Catherine frowned slightly. "Then what am I being denied?" Daniel paused, then answered quietly. "Time." That word shifted the atmosphere again. Catherine stood once more, walking toward the glass wall, her reflection now layered with uncertainty she could not immediately resolve. "If this is time-sensitive," she said slowly, "then your silence is part of the problem." Daniel turned slightly toward her. "My silence is what kept it contained," he said. Catherine did not respond immediately. For the first time, she looked less like a CEO and more like someone trying to assemble a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture no matter how many pieces she added. Outside, the city lights began to blur slightly as evening deepened. Inside the office, nothing had moved physically, yet everything had shifted structurally. Catherine finally spoke again, softer now. "Then what happens when silence is no longer enough?" Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "Then you will understand why it was chosen in the first place." The words lingered in the air without resolution. Catherine did not challenge them. Instead, she turned back toward the desk slowly, placing her hand on the closed folder as if acknowledging that whatever lay inside was no longer just data, but consequence waiting for permission to surface. The Monroe Holdings office was quieter than it had been in days, but the silence no longer carried comfort. It carried tension that had no clear direction. Catherine Monroe remained in the same position she had been in earlier, standing near her desk with the closed folder resting under her hand, as if she needed physical contact to confirm it had not disappeared. Daniel Brooks had not moved from the chair across from her in several minutes. The conversation between them had reached a point where words no longer resolved anything. They only defined how deep the uncertainty had become. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice steady but no longer fully controlled. "If silence was chosen as protection," she said, "then at some point someone decided protection was more important than truth." Daniel looked at her without immediate response. The weight of her statement was accurate, but incomplete. "Protection is not always about importance," he said finally. "Sometimes it is about timing." Catherine frowned slightly. "Timing for what?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window again, as if measuring something beyond the room. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "For consequences to remain contained." Catherine studied him carefully. This was no longer a negotiation of information. It was a negotiation of boundaries that had already been crossed long ago. She walked slowly back toward the desk, her hand resting on the edge as she looked at him. "Then explain why containment would require your daughter to appear in proximity records," she said. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, but his tone remained controlled. "Because containment is not perfect," he replied. "It leaks at the edges." Catherine did not respond immediately. She sat down again, though not fully relaxed. Her attention shifted back to the folder, then to the screen still displaying fragmented system entries. The structure she was analyzing was no longer just technical. It was behavioral. Someone had built intentional separation between layers of information. Not to hide data entirely, but to prevent reconstruction of meaning. That distinction unsettled her more than she expected. Daniel noticed her shift in focus but did not interrupt. Catherine finally spoke again, quieter now. "If I escalate this internally, it will trigger a full audit." Daniel nodded once. "That is expected." Catherine looked up at him. "And what happens then?" Daniel paused briefly before answering. "Then the system will try to correct itself." The phrase landed heavily. Catherine narrowed her eyes slightly. Systems do not correct themselves. People correct systems. Daniel met her gaze. Not always, he said. A silence followed, deeper than before. Catherine stood again, moving toward the glass wall, her reflection now layered with the faint glow of city lights beginning to shift into evening. You are speaking as if this is still active, she said slowly. Daniel did not deny it. That alone was enough to change the temperature of the room. Catherine turned slightly back toward him. Then why are you still outside of it? She asked. Daniel hesitated for the first time in several minutes. When he answered, his voice carried less explanation and more restraint. Because I removed myself before it expanded beyond control. Catherine absorbed that carefully. You removed yourself, she repeated. Daniel nodded. That was the only way to ensure my daughter remained outside its reach. The mention of his daughter again shifted the focus in the room. Catherine returned to her desk, but she did not sit. Instead, she placed both hands on the surface, grounding herself. Then she is not part of the system, she said slowly. Daniel nodded. She was never supposed to be visible at all. Catherine exhaled slightly, processing the contradiction. But she is visible now, she said. Daniel did not respond immediately. The implication of her statement hung between them. Visibility meant exposure. Exposure meant risk. Catherine finally closed the folder again, more decisively this time. If what you are saying is true, she said, then this is no longer about documentation. Daniel looked at her steadily. It was never about documentation, he replied. Catherine held his gaze. Then what is it about? Daniel paused, then answered quietly. It is about whether some things should remain unconnected. The words settled into the room without resistance. Catherine looked down briefly, then back at him. For the first time since this conversation began, she did not immediately pursue another question. Instead, she remained still, as if recognizing that every answer so far had only widened the gap between what was known and what was not. Outside, the city continued its movement, unaware of the quiet shift unfolding above it. Inside the office, neither Daniel nor Catherine spoke for several moments. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because both understood that anything said next would move them further into something neither of them could fully reverse. Catherine finally turned slightly away from the desk, her voice softer than before. Then we proceed carefully, she said. Daniel nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. And in that restrained exchange, without resolution or clarity, both of them understood that careful was no longer optional, it was necessary. The Monroe Holdings executive floor was almost empty now, but the air inside Catherine Monroe's office felt heavier than earlier, as if the building itself had absorbed every word spoken between her and Daniel Brooks and refused to release it. Catherine stood near her desk, one hand resting on the closed folder, the other holding a printed internal report that had just been delivered from compliance review. The lighting in the room was soft, but it did not soften anything. It only made the silence more precise. Daniel remained seated across from her, his posture unchanged, but his attention was no longer fully on her. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere internal, as if the conversation had already extended beyond the room and into something neither of them could fully pause. Catherine finally spoke, her voice controlled but no longer detached. If we proceed carefully, she said, then we need alignment on what we are actually investigating. Daniel looked at her without immediate response. He understood what she meant, but also what she was not yet willing to say directly. Alignment requires agreement on what is known, he said quietly. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. And what is known? Daniel paused. Very little, he replied. Catherine exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition of how incomplete that answer truly was. She walked toward the glass wall again, staring out at the city below. The lights had begun to deepen into night, reflecting against the glass in fragmented patterns. The system is not just incomplete, she said after a moment. It is inconsistent across departments. Daniel nodded once. That is intentional. Catherine turned slightly toward him. Intentional by design or by failure? Daniel met her gaze. Both are possible at the same time. The answer did not satisfy her, but it clarified something else. This was not a simple error in record-keeping. It was layered. Catherine returned to the desk and placed the report down beside the folder. Compliance flagged as secondary containment signature, she said. Daniel's expression changed slightly at the phrasing, not visibly alarmed, but more focused. That signature should not be accessible at your level, he said. Catherine did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him carefully. Then why is it accessible? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation carried more weight than any denial. Because something was never fully closed, he said finally. Catherine sat down again, slower this time. Explain closed, she said. Daniel looked toward the floor briefly before answering. Closed means removed from interaction pathways. Not just hidden. Catherine absorbed that silently. The distinction mattered. Hidden data could still be retrieved. Closed data could not be reconstructed without triggering system response. That meant what she was seeing was not just incomplete. It was actively preserved in a fragmented state. Then we are dealing with active architecture, she said slowly. Daniel nodded once. We are dealing with something that was designed to remain partially visible and partially unreachable at the same time. Catherine leaned back slightly, processing the implication. Her confidence was still present, but now layered with caution. That does not happen without oversight, she said. Daniel did not disagree. It does not happen without agreement, he corrected quietly. A pause followed. Catherine looked down at the documents again, then back at him. Your role in this, she said carefully, was not administrative. Daniel met her gaze steadily. No, he said. It was not. The room grew quieter after that exchange. Not because anything changed physically, but because the structure of understanding between them had shifted again. Catherine stood once more, walking slowly toward the window. If this is still partially active, she said, then any unresolved element could still trigger exposure. Daniel nodded slightly. That is why it remained silent for so long. Catherine turned back toward him. And now? Daniel paused. Now something has reintroduced proximity. Catherine's expression tightened slightly. Proximity to what? Daniel looked at her for a moment longer than before. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. To the point where separation was enforced. Catherine did not respond immediately. The implication of that statement settled into the room with increasing weight. She returned to the desk and placed both hands on its surface, as if grounding herself in something tangible. Then we need to map every access point, she said finally. Daniel nodded once. Carefully, he repeated. Catherine looked at him. Carefully is no longer optional, she said. Daniel agreed without hesitation. It never was. A long silence followed. Outside, the city continued its movement, unaware of the structural tension forming above it. Inside the office, Catherine Monroe and Daniel Brooks remained on opposite sides of a conversation that was no longer about documents or systems. It was about something that had been left unfinished for too long, and neither of them could yet see the full shape of what that incompleteness would demand when it finally resolved itself. The Monroe Holdings executive office had reached a strange kind of stillness, the kind that does not come from resolution but from exhaustion of certainty. Catherine Monroe stood near the glass wall again, but this time she was no longer just observing the city. She was thinking in layers, as if every reflection outside the window now corresponded to a fragment inside the system she was trying to reconstruct. Behind her, Daniel Brooks remained seated, though his attention had shifted inward, quieter now, more contained. The conversation from earlier had not ended, it had only changed form. Catherine finally spoke, her voice steady but no longer absolute. If mapping access points is the next step, she said, then we are already beyond administrative review. Daniel nodded once. We were beyond it long before this conversation started, he replied. Catherine turned slightly toward him. Then what exactly are we operating inside of? Daniel paused. That question did not require technical explanation. It required acknowledgement. We are operating inside the leftover structure of a decision that was never fully reversed, he said quietly. Catherine absorbed that without interrupting. For the first time, she did not immediately challenge the ambiguity. Instead, she moved back to her desk and sat down, opening a new layer of system logs on her screen. The data was fragmented, but now she was no longer trying to force coherence. She was tracing pattern. Daniel watched her work without speaking. There was a shift in her approach now. Less control, more observation. Catherine leaned forward slightly, scrolling through entries that spanned years but showed inconsistent closure points. These are not system errors, she said after a moment. These are interrupted sequences. Daniel responded calmly. That is another way of saying the same thing. Catherine glanced at him briefly. Not exactly, she said. Interrupted sequences imply intent to resume. The implication settled between them. Daniel did not deny it. Catherine continued scanning, her focus narrowing. There is a recurring identifier, she said. It appears across multiple sealed layers. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not visibly alarmed, but attentive. That identifier should not be visible, he said. Catherine looked at him directly now. It is visible, she replied. A silence followed. Not tense in the traditional sense, but heavy with recognition that visibility itself was part of the structure they were now dealing with. Catherine leaned back slightly. If this identifier connects across systems, she said slowly, then we are not looking at isolated records. We are looking at a linked architecture. Daniel nodded once. Yes, he said quietly. Catherine studied him for a moment longer. And you were inside that architecture, she said. Daniel did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried a controlled distance. I was adjacent to it, he said. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. That is a precise distinction. Daniel met her gaze. It has to be. Another pause followed. Catherine closed the system log window briefly, then reopened it in a different layer. The structure shifted on screen, revealing deeper indexing paths. This level of access requires authorization that no longer exists, she said. Daniel nodded. That is why it was never meant to be revisited. Catherine looked at him again. But it is being revisited, she said. Daniel agreed silently. Catherine stood once more, walking toward the window, but this time her posture was different. Less observational, more reflective. If this system was designed to remain partially active, she said, then someone anticipated future interference. Daniel responded quietly, or they anticipated that silence would eventually fail. Catherine turned back toward him. Silence already failed, she said. Daniel did not dispute it. The room held steady for several seconds. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion, unaware of the structural recalibration happening above it. Inside the office, Catherine returned to her desk, but instead of pursuing deeper layers immediately, she paused. That pause itself was new. She looked at Daniel. There is one thing I need to confirm, she said. Daniel waited. Catherine continued, her tone carefully measured. If your daughter is appearing in proximity records, then her presence is not accidental exposure. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but something subtle shifted in his posture. Catherine noticed. She did not press immediately. Instead, she softened her tone slightly. I am not asking for explanation, she added. I am asking for confirmation of structure. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Structure does not always protect intent, he said. Catherine held his gaze. Then what does? Daniel paused. Distance, he replied. The answer did not resolve anything. It reframed it. Catherine slowly closed the system interface again, not out of conclusion, but restraint. Then we maintain distance while we map, she said. Daniel nodded once. Carefully, he repeated. Catherine did not correct him this time. And in that shared silence, without agreement fully formed but without resistance remaining unchanged, both of them understood that whatever they were approaching was no longer just about records or systems, it was about a structure that had already begun reacting to their awareness. The Monroe Holdings executive floor had fallen into a deeper silence than before, the kind of silence that no longer felt like absence but completion. Catherine Monroe remained standing near the glass wall, her reflection layered against the city skyline, but her attention was no longer divided between screens and documents. Everything she had accessed, every fragmented record, every interrupted sequence, had converged into a pattern she could no longer unsee. Daniel Brooks stood across the room, no longer seated, as if both of them had unconsciously moved into the same level of awareness without needing to say it aloud. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice steady but changed, no longer investigative but reflective. The structure is not random, she said. Daniel nodded once. It never was. Catherine turned slightly toward him. Then it was maintained, she said. Daniel replied quietly, it was preserved. A pause followed, heavier than before, because both words carried different implications that still pointed toward the same unresolved truth. Catherine walked slowly back toward her desk but did not sit. Instead, she placed both hands on the surface, grounding herself as if confirming physical reality before continuing. If preservation is the correct term, she said, then someone is still responsible for maintaining its separation layers. Daniel did not deny it. Catherine continued, her tone more controlled again, though not fully restored. Which means current system stability depends on continued silence. Daniel looked at her directly. Yes, he said. Catherine studied him for a moment, then turned her gaze briefly toward the city beyond the glass. The lights outside had shifted into full night now, reflecting across the window in fragmented patterns that mirrored the structure they had been analyzing for hours. Then your resignation, she said slowly, was not an exit from the system. Daniel paused. It was a boundary enforcement, he replied. Catherine absorbed that without interruption. For someone like her, boundaries were always structural, but what Daniel described was not corporate. It was human. She returned to the folder on the desk, placing it carefully beside the system reports. If boundaries are being tested now, she said, then something triggered re-entry conditions. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. Yes, he said quietly. Catherine looked at him directly. What triggered it? Daniel did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was not avoidance. It was calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. Proximity that was never supposed to occur again. Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. Between what? Daniel hesitated. Then he said, between what was separated. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight that neither of them tried to reduce. Catherine slowly sat down at her desk, but she did not open any files. Instead, she remained still, processing not data but implication. Daniel remained standing, watching her carefully, as if both of them were aware that the conversation had crossed into territory where further detail would not simplify anything. It would only deepen the structure they were already inside. Catherine finally spoke again, quieter now. Then this is not a review anymore, she said. Daniel nodded once. No, he replied. It stopped being a review a long time ago. Catherine exhaled slowly, then closed her eyes briefly before reopening them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone entirely. Not executive. Not analytical. Then what is it now? Daniel looked at her for a long moment. When he answered, it was with the same restraint he had carried through every stage of this conversation. "It is recognition," he said. Catherine did not respond immediately. The words settled between them without resistance, without clarification, and without resolution. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its indifferent movement, unaware that somewhere above it, two people had reached the edge of understanding something